Lynn, thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and I also have to thank you for taking care of all the slides for me. You made my job very easy, and I do appreciate that. And I want to thank all of you for being here, so thank you. My name's Don Schaalman. My father, Warren Schaalman, served in the United States Navy during World War II. My purpose here today is to summarize, recognize, and honor his service and the service of the hundreds of thousands who, like him, served honorably with commitment and sacrifice in World War II. And I want to thank the North Andover Historical Society for enabling my presentation and the other presentations. And I would also like to thank the New England Patriots who played their game on Thursday night, freeing up people Sundays afternoons. But again, I do appreciate you all being here. There he is. My father was drafted into the U.S. Navy on February 29th, 1944. And he had a wife and a 2-year-old son when he went off to his basic training in his boot camp. His boot camp, his basic training was at the Sampson United States Navy Training Station on Lake Seneca in Romulus, New York, where, along with 411,928 other men and women, learned the basics and the essentials of serving in the armed forces, or in many cases, serving in the organizations and the institutions that supported the armed services. I say my dad was drafted at 32, which was somewhat at a disadvantage and a bit of an issue during his basic training. Because, see, my dad was a pretty good athlete. He's certainly a tennis player and baseball player. And he wanted to play on the unit's intramural basketball team. But he was significantly older than most everybody else there. Most of the people getting basic training were in their teens, the late teens or early to mid-20s. And when he volunteered, when he expressed his desire to play on the basketball team, the younger folks, whom he referred to as lads, the young lads said, "We're playing, you can be the manager." And there he is, in his little manager uniform, as manager of the Gilmore Unit Championship basketball team. And I have to think that he took particular pride in this achievement, because in all of the material that my dad saved and we have from his service in World War II, I have 7 copies of this particular issue of the Sampson News with his name and picture and the championship team shown. So in Sampson, you learned the basics of being a sailor, which included, of course, swimming and navigation and anti-aircraft artillery and gunnery and weaponry and firefighting and rowing. Sometimes you get to row in a boat on the lake, sometimes not.
What are they rowing in, Dad?
I don't know. I don't know. But I say, at Sampson, you learned the basics and the essentials of serving in the Navy. And what's interesting in my research is they had a ban on profanity. And I don't know whether that had any relationship at all to the fact that my dad never swore when I knew him. I don't know if he was a gentleman, and I don't know whether this was drummed into him in his service, but they're quite explicit in their rule book, but there shall be no profanity. So after basic training, my dad received orders for and reported to the USS Laws. The Laws was a Fletcher-class destroyer, about 370 feet long, about 40 feet wide. There were 175 Fletcher-class destroyers built during World War II, including the USS Cass and Young, which I'll make some reference to later on. Of the 175 built during World War II, 25 were sunk or damaged beyond repair in World War II. They were built to be fast. They had oil-fired steam boilers that produced an astonishing 60,000 shaft horsepower, had a top speed of 36 knots, well over 40 miles an hour, as they were part of the Fast Carrier Task Force. They were assigned to protect and defend carriers that were built to be fast, and so they had to be fast and they had to be light, which meant that they didn't have a lot of armament. They weren't double-plated steel below the hull. They didn't have heavy decks, but they were made to be light. In fact, the ship had a displacement of around 2,000 tons, 2,050-ton displacement. And just for reference, a cruise ship these days, which perhaps many of you have been on, has a displacement of around 100,000 tons, which means that this warship had about 1/50th of the displacement of a large cruise ship these days. Had a complement of 273 officers and men, and because they were relatively light and very fast, they got beaten up on the sea, and the sea took quite a toll, and it was rough sailing, particularly at the speeds at which they were designed to sail. They earned the nickname Tin Cans because, in fact, they behaved like tin cans on the ocean. The Laws was launched in from the Seattle-Tacoma shipyard in Washington State in late '43. It was commissioned in '44, was utilized in the war, decommissioned in 1946, but it was recommissioned in 1951 and served during the Korean conflict. During the Korean conflict, there was a young Navy engineer on the ship by the name of John Young. John Young became the 9th man to walk on the moon as the commander of Apollo 16. He later went on to fly the space shuttle. Now, my dad knew that, and he thought that was pretty cool. Let's see, my dad reported to the Laws, where he discovered that his age was actually a benefit, because I believe this is in Pearl Harbor. The crew had the task of going over the side of the ship on bosun's chairs, basically little kid swings with ropes. They were to paint the exterior of the hull from the waterline up. And so the guys were going over the side of the ship on a rope. And as my dad dutifully waited to go over the side of the ship on a rope, the commanding officer, a fellow by the name of Commander Lester Wood, spotted my dad and walked up to him and said, "So, sailor, how old are you?" And I think my dad probably responded with something like 32 years, 2 months, and 10 days, sir. But anyway, upon hearing the 32, the commander, the ship captain, took my dad into the office area of the ship in the interior of the ship and made him a storekeeper 3rd class, answering to the supply officer. And what that did was it kept him from having to go over the side of the ship on a rope, but more importantly for today, it gave him almost continuous access to a typewriter. And so when the duties of the storekeeper 3rd class were done and the supply officer was satisfied, my dad used the typewriter to write letters, lots of letters, to his wife, to his son, to his father, to his friends. And he also kept, I won't call it a diary or a log, but he kept a narrative. He kept a journal of what was going on the ship, where the ship had been, what the activities had been, and what the general feeling aboard the ship was. And so it's those letters and that narrative that have most of what you're going to see and hear today. The mission of the Laws was to protect and defend the battle group, mostly the aircraft carriers, and to provide support to the amphibious landings in the island hopping campaign as the Marines and the Navy and the U.S. forces moved west across the Pacific toward Japan. It was called picket duty, largely because the destroyers formed a protective fence around the remainder of the battle group, and their job was to detect and to alert and to defend the remainder of the battle group against threats from submarines and surface ships and aircraft, and so they participated in and performed anti-submarine, anti-aircraft, and anti-ship weapon use, and in some cases anti-mine duty. They sailed from Pearl Harbor on the 31st of May 1944 with a schedule to be back in Pearl Harbor in October after a duration at sea of about 135 days. But their time at sea was extended and extended and extended so that the Laws did not return to Pearl Harbor until, instead of October 44, September 15th of 1945. After almost 16 months at sea, during which time my dad set foot on dry land a total of 6 times in the 16 months. But the USS Laws participated in most, if not certainly most, of the major Pacific battles in the latter 18 months of World War II, including Kwajalein Atoll, the capture and occupation of the Marianas Islands, including Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. Participated in the first battle of the Philippine Sea, including the famous Marianas Turkey Shoot, in which over 300 enemy planes were shot down. In September and October of 14, they performed bombardment and the first strikes on some of the islands in the Philippines, and the first Okinawa bombardment. That's in preparation for what would be amphibious landings months later. And in October of 1944, they participated in the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Leyte Gulf was the largest naval battle in World War II, and given the armament that was available for the ships and the submarines and the aircraft, it is considered to be the largest naval battle ever fought. It was really 4 separate battles, which were all fought at about the same time, over an area of over 500,000 square miles, twice the area of Texas. It was a decisive victory for the U.S. naval forces, but it resulted in the loss of several significant naval assets, including the USS Princeton. The USS Princeton was a destroyer in my dad's battle group, and my dad wrote about it in the journal, and he says, Task Force 58 was under attack early that day, and we were kept busy shooting at enemy planes, one of which did succeed in placing a bomb on the luckless, though gallant, Princeton in our immediate group. Our division mate, the Morrison, our squadron mate, the Irwin, and together with the cruiser Birmingham were assigned to aid the stricken carrier, and were all 3 damaged by explosions during the firefighting and rescue work. Though their efforts were in true Navy tradition and style, it eventually became obvious that the Princeton was doomed, and in fact the Princeton sank. But here you can see the fantail of the USS Irwin. That's a Fletcher-class destroyer that my dad refers to. And here is the cruiser, the USS Birmingham. Now the USS Birmingham pulled alongside the Princeton in an attempt to put out the fire and to save crew members. In fact, the Irwin rescued 646 crew members, either from the decks of the Princeton or from the waters immediately surrounding it. The Birmingham was conducting firefighting activities and was within 50 feet of the Princeton when the Princeton exploded. All of the armaments, including the fuels and the ammunition and the bombs for the aircraft, exploded in a very quick series of explosions that literally ripped the Princeton in half. And the explosion, the blast, the debris, and the shrapnel that hit the Birmingham resulted in 229 deaths on Birmingham during the firefighting activities. It's just after, one of the things that strikes me about this slide is, you know how we talked about swimming and rowing and firefighting being important, son of a gun? They were essential skills learned during his basic training. Yes?
Was the Birmingham a cruiser?
A cruiser, yes. Yep. So it's about this time, just after the Battle of Leyte Gulf, which is in October of 44, that on the 21st of November 44, my dad writes a letter to his father in which he says, you know, I say I'm a landlubber, but that's only because that's now my life's ambition. I have seen so much of the ocean in the last few months that I dream of New England's green hills. And in spite of my dislike for the ocean and all attached to it, you'll doubtless be glad and perhaps pleased to learn that I have yet to be seasick, and they tell me that the chances of my being seasick at this late date are rare, and realize that he's been at sea for about 5 months. He has no idea that he's about to extend that to 16, but he has developed, if not a hatred, at least a real dislike for the ocean and everything attached to it, and that sentiment is pretty much uniform across the crew. In fact, my dad writes some more, and he says, so one of the lads gets asked, where is he going to live when he returned home? And this fellow said that he was going to put a pair of oars over his shoulder and just start walking inland. And when he came to a place where someone asked him, what are those things and what are they for? That's where he was going to spend the rest of his days. And he said, I naturally can't give you, this is to his dad, I naturally can't give you any details of what I've been up to or where I've been, but you get a pretty fair idea when you read the newspapers, which I know you do. Let me just say, the fighting is fierce. And so, just after my dad writes this letter in which he says, I've become unhappy or developed a real dislike for the ocean, a typhoon develops in the Pacific, a typhoon that comes to be known as Typhoon Cobra. It was a big storm, sustained winds of 95 miles an hour, gusts well over 100, 70-foot waves. Remember, the ship is only 40 feet wide and 370 feet long. The commander, the captain, Commander Wood, realized the likelihood of terrible conditions coming into the typhoon, and he somehow persuaded one of the larger ships to fill his fuel tanks. And so he wanted to get the ship as low in the water as possible, make it as seaworthy as possible, with the idea of giving him and the crew a better chance of surviving the storm. And the Laws did survive the typhoon. At one point it rolled 47 degrees, but righted itself with minor injuries to the crew, but terrific damage to the typewriter that my dad was using, which hit the deck and was pretty well beaten up, which my father notes in the letters that he writes after December of 44, all the way through 45, saying the overstrikes and the failure of the rolling mechanism to properly, that was not an indication of his decreasing or diminishing typing skills. It was in fact the fault of the machine. But the Laws survived the typhoon. 3 of the destroyers that were with the group, the Hull, the Monaghan, and the Spence, capsized and sank. And of the more than 800 men aboard the 3 ships, only 91 of them survived. That's 1944. As we go into 1945, the ship is off of Formosa, now Taiwan, and they have additional strikes in the Philippines, and they get within 45 miles of the Japan coast and within 25 miles of the coast of the mainland in Asia, and are bombing and using the artillery bombardment on Hong Kong, Saigon, and Cam Bay. You notice some of those areas become much more familiar to the general public 20-something years later. But we have to remember, this was a world war, and we think of World War I starting in 1941, but in fact, the Japanese had been in Mongolia in 1931, and they had essentially been conducting all-out war from 1937 on. They still had, in the beginning of 1945, they still had somewhere between 700,000 and 1.2 million soldiers in Asia. And there was thought that they would try to make it to the coast of Asia and then onto the homeland islands of Japan in an effort to augment the defense of the homeland islands, which they believed was coming as the U.S. was pushing west. So the Laws was one of the ships that had the task of attacking some of the Japanese installations, both on Taiwan and on the mainland of China. And they also used the carrier-based aircraft to bomb Tokyo, and the aircraft carriers were, of course, guarded by the destroyers. And then later we'll have the Battle of Okinawa, but I just want to point out this is Ernie Deacon, Frederick Ernest Deacon, Captain U.S. Army, 97th Division Infantry, serving the U.S. Army in the European theater of operation, fighting the Germans. He was my dad's best friend. They were in the Boy Scouts together. This is the two of them right back here. They went to the same church. They were tennis partners. They graduated from Revere High School together in 1929. Ernie was a groomsman in my parents' wedding, and my dad was best man at Ernie's wedding to his wife Elizabeth, whom everybody called Lib. In early June of 1945, with my dad in the Pacific, he gets a letter from Lib, and it's dated May 18th, which is a full 10 days after the war in Europe has been declared over on May 8th. Although most of the fighting ended around May 6th or May 7th. The letter is dated May 18th, and she writes my dad to say that she has seen his wife and son, and she saw them at a church service in the old neighborhood, and she wanted him to know that they were fine, that of all the things he had to worry about, he didn't have to worry about them. She had seen them, and they were fine. She also says that the latest letter she had from Ernie was dated the 23rd of April. And that concerned her some, but not a lot, because his letter had said that they were mostly an occupation army now. The fighting was diminishing rapidly. The war was clearly coming to an end. The push onto Berlin was being done largely by the Russians. And see, the 97th Infantry Division was an occupation army. They were taking German prisoners, and they were liberating concentration camps along the German-Czech border, and were spending a considerable amount of their time treating the sick and the dying and burying corpses that they encountered in the concentration camps. And they were spending time figuring out who was going to go home at the end of the war and who was going to be assigned and moved to the Pacific theater of operation to support the continuing war against the Japanese in the Pacific. And she was hoping to see Ernie if, for at least a couple of days, if he was one of the people being sent to the Pacific Theater. What she didn't know when she wrote the letter was that her husband was already dead. He'd been in a Jeep accident, the details of which I really know nothing, but he was in a Jeep accident and had been hospitalized, and in fact was being moved from Germany and then France and then to England. He was being flown to a hospital in England. He was essentially going home. It was a C-46 with 25 patients or passengers and a crew of 5. They were flying to England. The weather was bad, low clouds, fog. The pilot got below the low cloud level and clipped a radio tower on the ground. It tore the right wing off the airplane, and the plane crashed, and all aboard were killed. And the date was May 6th, which was essentially the last day of fighting in Europe. They communicate. My dad and Lib communicate a couple of times, and in July, she sends, it's almost a couple of months after he's killed, she sends him the some of the newspaper articles and the obituary and so on. And my dad, on a visit to England, took a picture of his best friend's grave. He's buried in the American Cemetery in Cambridge, England. But while all that's going on, the Laws is engaged in fighting the Battle of Okinawa. The Battle of Okinawa is a long and bloody battle. It is, in fact, one of the longest battles in the Pacific Theater. It has the largest initial amphibious assault, over 60,000 U.S. soldiers. And over the course of the battle, they expect that there is over 100,000 soldiers in the amphibious assaults. There are 49,157 casualties, including 7,000 ground forces, and for the first time, nearly 5,000 naval forces. And the naval forces the losses consist largely of men aboard destroyers that have come under kamikaze attack. To give you a sense of scale, 3 times the ammunition and material is expended at Okinawa than is expended at Iwo Jima. And that includes 600,000 rounds of artillery fired from the ships that are offshore. And this is the fast carrier task force way off, several miles off in the distance, and the Laws is out there somewhere. 600,000 rounds fired from the offshore naval vessels, including the Laws. There were over 1,900 kamikaze attacks, resulting in the sinking of 34 ships and landing craft. And as I said early, of the 175 Fletcher-class destroyers that were built, 25 of them were sunk during World War II, and 17 of that 25 were sunk at the Battle of Okinawa. The U.S. Laws is credited with rescuing 107 men from the USS Callahan, which is one of the victims of a kamikaze attack, and they participated in several other rescue and recovery operations. Regarding the kamikaze attacks, the noted naval historian Samuel Eliot Morison, in his book, The Two-Ocean War, says about the kamikazes, quote, "Few weapons have ever spread such flaming terror, such torturing burns, such searing death, as did the self-destroying onslaughts on the radar pickets and other ships. Naval history has few parallels to the sustained courage, resourcefulness, and fighting spirit that the crews of these vessels displayed day after day after day at the Battle of Okinawa." During the Battle of Okinawa, in May of 1945, my dad again writes to his father and says, in part in the letter, "I'm waiting to learn more of the little gifts that you're working on for our enemy. We sure need something. For the life of me, I can't see how they continue to fight, but they do. And I'm sure that all you're reading in the newspapers about them is true. You can well imagine how we are waiting, we're hoping, we're praying for the expected help from the other side of the pond now that old Adolf has said uncle or however it is you say I give up in German." And again, regarding the Cassiniang and regarding the Battle of Okinawa and kamikazes, he says in his narrative that later on the Sunday afternoon, the luck of the Cassiniang ran out, for while patrolling, she was hit by a suicide plane, and suffered considerable damage to her bridge, and several men were killed. In fact, the Castagnone was hit twice, once in April or late April or early May, and the other in July 30th. And on July 30th, the damage was significant, killed 22 and wounded 45. And I mentioned the Castagnone because the Castagnone is now part of the Boston National Historical Park. It's right near the USS Constitution in what used to be the Boston Navy Yard or the Charlestown Navy Yard, and you can go visit it. And if you haven't, it's a very interesting take. The docents are wonderful, and you could learn a lot more about the exploits of the Castagnone and about the task force and about the U.S. Navy in the Pacific War, World War II. And if you haven't done it yet, I recommend it. In the same narrative, he talks about the difficult conditions at Okinawa, but then he says, nevertheless, on August 6th, the series of news items which was to cause a boost in our morale began. For on that day, we received our first reports of the dropping on Japan of the first atomic bomb and the extensive damage it had caused. This news was followed 4 days later by Russia's declaration of war against Japan, and once again we began to have some hope of being released for the long and oft-promised trip back to the States. And he writes to his wife, he writes to my mother, and I'll spare you most of what he says to his wife, but he says, the other breathtaking news was the revelation of the new atomic bomb which was finally dropped on our enemy. I only hope that they do have the power they're supposed to have and that they don't spare the horses in getting plenty of them to where they'll do the most good. I think that's the one that Dad mentioned to me some time ago in a letter. He said he was working on parts of a bomb that the Japanese surely wouldn't like. And at the time he asked if I had heard of the motor bomb. I hadn't then, and was always waiting for an announcement of it, and this, it seems to me, is it. And so, he says, meanwhile, all ears are tuned to radio broadcasts, and whenever possible, the latest reports are listed with avid interest. On Tuesday, 14 August, the Japanese announced their willingness to accept the conditions of the Potsdam Declaration, which was an unconditional surrender, and that official confirmation would be received in Washington in a couple of days. There was no great outburst of jubilation on board, simple, quiet rejoicing that the tremendous job that we had done had finally been finished, and now perhaps we would be able to go home, something which meant more to us than even ending of the terrible war. And thus it is that we did loudly rejoice when our captain announced on Sunday afternoon, 26th of August, that a message had been received stating that the Laws would be detached for return to the States. And on September 2nd, which they called VH Day for Vigo Home Day, the Laws, the only ship of all classes to have started the Okinawa campaign and remain until the lights came on, was eventually to go home. And so, my dad survived the war and returned home to be with his wife and his now 4.5-year-old son and his father. And on the 10th of February, 1946, at 11 o'clock in the morning from what was the Fargo building and is now the Barnes building on Summer Street in Boston, my father was given an honorable discharge. He was officially awarded the Asiatic Pacific Ribbon with 6 battle stars, the Philippine Liberation Ribbon with 2 stars, and the World War II Victory Medal. Again, historian Samuel Eliot Morrison says, that one feels particular admiration for the officers and men of the destroyers, the tin cans which operated in every theater of the war. They not only had to be first-rate ship handlers, but men of science to assimilate the new techniques in anti-submarine warfare and air defense. In every theater, in every kind of operation, destroyers were the indispensable component. Whether in convoy duty or in hunter-killer groups in the Atlantic, supporting amphibious operations, delivering torpedo attacks in night battles, or taking the rap from the kamikazes off of Okinawa, the men who manned these ships proved themselves to be among the most versatile and courageous of sea warriors. And so he was discharged on February 10th of 1946, and in March of 46, he received this letter from the Secretary of the Navy, which states, "My dear Mr. Schaalman, I have addressed this letter to reach you after all the formalities of your separation and from active service are completed. I've done so because, without formality and as clearly as I know how to say it, I want the Navy's pride in you, which it is my privilege to express, to reach into your civilian life and to remain with you always. You have served in the greatest Navy in the world. It crushed 2 enemy fleets at once, receiving their surrenders only 4 months apart. It brought our land-based air power within bombing range of the enemy and set our ground armies on beachheads of final victory. It performed the multitude of tasks necessary to support these military operations, and no other Navy at any time has done so much. For your part in these achievements, you deserve to be proud as long as you live. The nation which you served at a time of crisis will remember you with gratitude. The best wishes of the Navy go with you into civilian life. Good luck." Signed, James Forrestal. To which I just add, well done, Dad. Thank you.
Did your father happen to mention when they sounded general quarters, where he was stationed?
He was in between the, let's see, do I need to do this? He was somewhere in the chain of message transmission from the radio room to the bridge, and somewhere in the communication of orders and back and forth from the bridge to other parts of the ship. He was not, as far as I know, a member of anybody that had to man a 5-inch gun or a 20 millimeter or a 40 millimeter gun. He was, he was an old guy, and so they treated him with some respect.
It was important because communications could get cut between the engine room and the captain on the bridge,
Yes, yeah,
and you'd have to run down.
yeah, yeah. And I'm pretty sure of that, and one of the reasons I'm pretty sure of that is one of the things that appears in his collection of material is clearly a telegram that comes from Admiral Halsey, and it's in code, but my dad had it, and I think it was one of those things he might have had it in his pocket, and then years later he pulls it out and has it. But he was somewhere in the chain of getting the messages to and from the radio room on the Laws.
I'm going to get Keith set up, but are there any other questions for Don while I pull this presentation down and put up another one? And Joanne, do you want, if there's, yeah, anybody that wants to ask any more questions?
Right.
I have one question.
Sure.
Let me just pass you the microphone. Please speak directly into the mic. Thank you.
I just wanted to know, did your father ever have anything nice to say about the ocean again?
No. Nope. And in fact, he grew up in Revere. He was at the beach all the time as a kid, and I knew him for 27 years. I never saw him go in the ocean, and I only saw him go in a lake a couple of times, and that was a big occasion. The fact that he would swim was remarkable. So the short answer to your question is no. All right.
you said he was in a task force. How many aircraft carriers would be in a task force, and would we remember any of the names?
Well, Task Force 58 and Task Force 38, Task Force 34, they were in Task Force 58, which is, I'll say, recognized and honored as one of the most successful task forces in the Navy. One of the reasons the duration of the time at sea was extended so long was that they were having, that is the task force, and including the Laws, was having luck and has a great record of shooting down enemy aircraft. And it was not at all unusual for some of the carriers and some of the larger ships to specifically request certain warships, certain destroyers, to be part of their picket. And so the Laws was part of the Task Force 58 that kept getting extended because as the rest of the fleet moved west, they asked that the Laws and the other ships go with them.
Also, they didn't have the opportunity to pull up to a gas station. Always had that in the back of their mind.
Yes, let's say he set foot on dry land 6 times over the course of 16 months. Most of that was probably at places like Ulithi and Eniwetok and Guam, where they would go for a day or two to get new equipment and to have repairs and maintenance done and to get supplies. I do know that he was on Okinawa. He was running a supply operation, and he was on Okinawa. It was about 7 miles from the Shuri line. So they could see and they could hear the battles, but I know that the only place that I really know he was on land was at Okinawa, and I presume that the rest of it was while they were in one of the other stations to provide maintenance and supplies.
So do you end up serving?
I did not, nope. And so I'll say my dad had a great respect for the young officers who got the ship and all the men on it successfully through the war. And he had great admiration and respect for the young naval officers who were all Annapolis grads. And he never put too much emphasis on it, but we used to, my dad would take me to the open houses at the Boston Navy Yard, and we'd take a picture of me standing on the carrier deck or behind the 20 millimeter anti-aircraft gun. He would have liked me to go to Annapolis, and I think he was a little disappointed when I decided that wasn't for me, but I did not. My older brother did. My older brother, who's 2 and 4 in here. My older brother did. He was in the Air Force in '63 and through '67, but no, but I did not.
Do we have any more questions? All right.
Round of applause for Don.
Thank you.
I'm curious, anyone out here have parents that were in the Navy in World War II? My grandfather was. Okay. Okay.
And now, because we want to balance it out, we're going to give equal time to the Army. So welcoming Keith Wentzel, who's going to do the second part of our presentation. Keith was born in Detroit, Michigan. He is a very avid and rabid graduate of Michigan State University. He is married to his charming wife, Lynn. We've been here about 40 years, and Keith worked in finance for his career, and since he's retired, he is a very valuable member of a number of volunteer organizations, including the North Andover Historical Society, where he's on the finance committee. So he's been volunteered in a lot of capacities, giving his time and energy in his finance background. Anything else? 2 kids, Kirsten and Matt. That's enough. Okay. We may or may not have tech issues with the clip that is
Okay. First of all, has anybody, how many people here have either read the book Band of Brothers or seen part of the miniseries or are aware of it? Okay, a lot of people. Okay, so this kind of follows a lot of what you might have seen in the miniseries or the book, because my dad was part of the Band of Brothers, the Easy Company 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment. This is their patch or logo, and over there you'll see that the same logo on that poster. That poster was signed by all of the living vets as of when the miniseries came out in 2001. So afterward, you might want to just go up there and kind of check it out. It's kind of an interesting thing. It hangs in our family room at our house. Okay, this is my father, Walter Wentzel. He was 1st Platoon Easy Company, 506 Parachute Infantry Regiment, eventually part of the 101st Airborne. He was born in Detroit, August 28th, 1923. His parents, my grandparents, had immigrated from Germany to the U.S. after World War I. And as it turns out, my background, although we were culturally German, my background really is more Russian and Eastern European than Germanic, because that part of the world kind of changed hands all the time. So things were going back and forth. And I believe now it's part of Poland. And the question was, why did they come to Detroit? Well, this is after World War I, late teens, early 20s. That's where the jobs were. The auto industry was just getting going. And so a lot of Germans, Eastern Europeans came to Detroit and settled there. My dad attended Cass Tech High School, which was an exam school for the brightest students in Detroit. It's still there. Still an exam school, and the best and brightest in Detroit still attend there. And after graduation in 1942, August of 42, he enlisted in the Army and chose to volunteer for a newly formed parachute regiment, the 506th. At the time, paratroopers were a new concept, initially developed by the Germans during the invasions of Norway and Denmark. So this was kind of a brand new thing that he was getting involved in. And this was Ed Tipper. This was one of his best friends. And he also joined up with my dad and became part of the 506 Parachute Infantry Regiment. I don't know why they decided to join the paratroopers. Maybe it was the extra $50 a month they got in jump pay, or it was just the excitement of doing something different. But he and Ed both decided they were going to join the paratroopers, and off they went. And the first stop was Camp Toccoa. This is in northern Georgia, and you can see up here, Currahee, that was this mountain right here that they used to every day run up and run down. 3 miles up, 3 miles down. And this was a photo of the troopers back then. This is what the camp looked like when it first opened. This was in summer of 1942. And it was interesting. This was originally called Camp Toombs, and it was named after a Confederate Civil War general. But Colonel Robert Sink, who was in charge of the 506, decided to change the name from Toombs because they thought it might spook some of the new recruits coming in. So because it was in Toccoa, Georgia, they changed the name to Camp Toccoa, and hopefully that helped people get over that. Quick family story. We went on a trip down to Florida one time. I was about 10 years old. We stopped at Camp Toccoa. There was virtually nothing there. There were no people, some rudimentary buildings still there that were just about falling down. Now it's really kind of a tourist spot. I don't know if it's a national park, but it's still part of the Park Service. And we saw eagles flying up around Mount Currahee, which is kind of interesting because the eagle was the insignia of the 101st Airborne. So my father thought that was kind of cool back then. And this was part of the training. This was a photo of troopers that were running up the mountain. And this was Herbert Sobel. He was the commanding officer of Easy Company, the 506 Parachute Infantry Regiment. And Sobel was not very well liked by his men. He was a graduate of the University of Illinois. He joined the Army Reserves in 1937. A lot of the men saw him as petty, arbitrary, domineering tyrant. For the most minuscule infractions, He would have serious punishments. This was written by Dick Winters, who was eventually the commanding officer of Easy Company as that went along. But in quoting Winters, he said that he had a desire to lead by fear rather than by example. And out of earshot, the enlisted men referred to him as the effing Jew, because there weren't too many Jewish people in the regiment or in the army at that point in time. So, but despite his harsh tactics, he proved effective in training the men and instilling a significant amount of discipline and physical training with them. And was there the other part of this? Was going to slide in? What's that? Hit it again? Okay. And this was David Schwimmer, formerly of Friends. You might recognize him. But he played Herbert Sobel in the miniseries Band of Brothers. And if you look at the two of them together, they look pretty similar. And if you saw the miniseries, a lot of the actors that portrayed the veterans, I think they recruited them because they looked a lot like the veterans and acted a lot like the veterans. So it was kind of an interesting way that they did that. And all these guys were unknown back then, except for David Schwimmer. He was about the only actor that was known. Okay. Am I supposed to do something with the...
Try hitting enter again, and if it doesn't, we're just going on.
Yeah, we'll go on. Huh? We had a clip, but okay, that's not working. But that was from the miniseries. At the end of training, they trained at Camp Toccoa from August of 42 to December of 42. And to finish their training, Colonel Sink had read about a Japanese outfit that had done a forced march of about 100 miles in a 75-hour period. And that was considered the world record at the time. I don't know how I don't think they had the Guinness Book of Records that was confirming that, but that was the record. So Sink decided, okay, we're going to have our troopers, we're going to one-up them on that. So Toccoa was about 120 miles from Atlanta, so he decided he was going to march his guys from Toccoa to Atlanta in the first week of December 1942. The weather was miserable. It was rainy, like raw here in New England, temperature in the 40s during the day, below freezing at night. They had sleet, rain, some snow, and it was miserable, but they did march to Atlanta. They did it in 75 hours, almost 40 miles per day, and almost the entire regiment made it. There's a few guys that had to drop out, but almost the entire regiment made it. And this was like big news. It was all across the country back then. This was like a big accomplishment, and I think it was really promoted because the U.S. was just getting into the war. This was late 1942, and I think they looked at it as a morale booster for the rest of the country. Regiment was about, I want to say 2,000 men roughly. And from there, they went on to, after finishing the basic training, they went on to Fort Benning. And this was where jump training went. This was, Fort Benning was in Georgia, near the Alabama border. And what they were doing there was, as you can see up here in the top left, let me just use the pointer. This was packing their chutes, getting ready for jumps. This was actual jumping, getting onto the one of the C-47s where they did their first 5 jumps and got their jump wings there. But they also trained off these jump towers. They would climb up these towers that were a couple hundred feet high and jump off. It was a simulation. The parachute would open like that, the canopy deployed. And this was also a wind machine that they practiced with, this big wind machine, practiced controlling the chute, that if they did a drop and the winds were blowing that day, the winds would fill up that chute and it could drag a man down through a field. But they practiced getting that chute down as quickly as possible. And this was just a mass jump while they were training down there in Fort Benning. And that was December 42 to March of 1943. From there, they went to Camp McCall. And as you can see, Camp McCall was a sprawling base. It was Camp McCall was about 465 miles from Fort Benning. Fort Benning was near the Alabama border. Camp McCall was in North Carolina, sort of central North Carolina. But what was interesting was the camp, construction started in November of 42 at Camp McCall. By March, 4 months later, when the 506 got there, there were 65 miles of paved road, 1,200 bed hospital, 5 movie theaters, and 6 large beer gardens, 3 5,000-foot runways, and a total of 1,750 buildings. This was all like within 4 months. So it's an example of what was going on in the mobilization of the United States back then as the country geared up for war. From there, they went on to maneuvers in March of, in May of 43. They went up to Kentucky, Tennessee, and Indiana, and they were with other units up there. They were doing large-scale maneuvers, and for 2 months they were in the field training. At that point in time, they became assigned to the 101st Airborne Division. So at this point, smaller battle groups were now being folded into larger groups that were eventually going to be used for the invasions. And that was in early summer of 1943. And after that, they went to Fort Bragg. There they were doing night maneuvers, more parachute jumps. They would go out into the field 2 or 3 days at a time doing training, living in foxholes, that type of thing, simulated attacks on enemy lines, explosives training, just continuing more training and more on tactics, as well as the physical training too. And in September of 1943, they shipped out to England. So they took a train from Fort Bragg up to New York City, got on a steamship which was called the Samaria. It was an Indian liner that had capacity for about 1,000 people. They had 5,000 people on that ship, so as you can imagine, living conditions were not too good in the trip over to England. But they landed up in Liverpool. They were bussed down to Elborn, which is right there, and that's what was going to be their home from then until the end of May in 1944. Now these other 2 stars here, this is Upottery, and this is the destination that they took off from when they flew into Normandy for the invasion on June 6th, actually June 5th, 1944. And down here was Sainte-Marie-de-Mont in Normandy. That was their ultimate destination where they were going to be starting the invasion. This was about maybe 60 miles from Elborn down to Upottery, and was maybe 100 miles or so, 120 miles down that they were going to fly when they dropped into Normandy. But they continued training there, and that went on, pretty much continuing to do drops, continued to work on tactics, et cetera, et cetera. But here was a significant part of what happened with Easy Company, and if you saw the miniseries or read the book, you might recall the mutiny of the NCOs. Now, when they got to England, this was like November of 1943. Sobel decided he was going to have a latrine inspection. He wanted Winters to do the inspection. Winters was his executive officer. Sobel was in charge of the company. So he he ordered Winters to show up at 11 o'clock to do the latrine inspection. Winters shows up at 11 o'clock. The inspection's already been completed by Sobel, and Sobel starts berating him for being late. And Winters says, well, you told me to report at 11 o'clock. He says, well, I changed the orders, and I told you to report at 10:30. He says, well, I never got notice of that. Oh, we sent a runner for you. No, they didn't send any runner. So this was just Sobel playing another one of his tricks and trying to be a bit of a bully. Well, he was going to punish Winters by confining him to base, which wasn't a big deal because he didn't really go too much into London or anything like that or do much partying when he was the executive officer. But the NCOs caught wind of this, and they said, the NCOs being the sergeants that were really sort of the key members of the company, and they wrote a letter to Colonel Sink saying they were all going to, unless Sobel was replaced, they were all going to resign their positions. So Sink saw this and immediately called all the NCOs in and read them the riot act, threatened to shoot them for mutiny, Eventually, he busted a few of them and transferred a few of them. Most of them just remained in their positions. But at that point, he decided that Sobel couldn't continue to lead this company because it just wasn't, the men weren't behind him. So there was a new jump school that was opening up in England. He transferred Sobel to head up the jump school, which he was good at training, but not at leading men. And at that point, Winters was made the commander of the 1st Platoon in Easy Company, and Thomas Meehan, who was in Baker Company, was transferred in as the new commanding officer for Easy Company. And his name will come up a little later as we go through this. But this all happened in November of '43, so it gives you an idea, you know, the issues that the men had with their leadership, their immediate leadership at that point in time. Then we get to the Day of Days. This is June 4th, 1944. They're going down to Upottery. They're trucked down there. The invasion is scheduled for them to take off on the night of the 4th, the invasion on the 5th. Bad weather comes in. Ike decides, okay, we can't go on the 5th. We're going to delay it a day. So they get ready. Again, the next night they're jumping, or their planes are leaving late in the evening on the 5th. And as you can see up here, this was, a lot of the men went into battle with war paint. They wanted to paint themselves, I think because curry, he was an Indian word, I think they felt some closeness with Indian warriors. So a lot of them had face paint on when they went into battle on the jump. This was a painting that was done of a C-47 and the men getting ready to go on, which is, I think, pretty cool. Part of Valor publications. They've got a lot of paintings about World War II and a lot about the Band of Brothers if you're ever interested in that. Next, this is the purportedly, and I think it's been recorded, the most published photo of World War II. A lot of people have seen this. This was Ike addressing the troops. This actually was the 502nd, not the 506th. I thought it was the 506th originally because this guy right here looks a lot like my father, and I thought that was him. But no, this was the 502nd, and this was Walter Strobel standing right here. And I'll show you another picture. This was Walter Strobel. This was sometime in the 90s, and he is at one of the 101st Airborne Division reunions. And the fellow sitting, this is Mark Bando, who also was a World War II historian, wrote a number of books about Easy Company and mostly about the 101st and the 506th. But I thought that was a cool photo because a lot of people recognize that photo. And this gives you an idea of, okay, what was Easy Company doing? What was the 101st Airborne, 82nd Airborne? What were they actually doing when they were going into France? Well, they were jumping in. This was the night of June 5th. They were parachuting in somewhere around midnight or just after midnight on June 6th. And their goals, well, for Easy Company and for the 101st, they were down here by Saint-Marie-du-Mont, right down there. That was their targets in these drop zones C and D. The 82nd Airborne was up more around Saint-Mary-Glisse. But the reason that they were parachuted into these spots was because the invasion was going to occur the next morning, or that morning, at daybreak. And this was how the troops were going to be coming in on the Higgins boats to land on the shore. And there were 4 roads that led up from the beach to this major highway here. And those roads had to be kept clear because this whole other area in here, which was once just open meadows, the Germans had flooded, so troops could not use those areas for transportation. They had to come through these 4 causeways. And the Germans were back here and had guns sighted on all of these causeways. So the idea was the paratroopers were going to come in the night before, try and take out as many German gun emplacements as they could along here to open up the invasion route for the troops that were coming in. This is Utah Beach here. The fighting at Utah Beach was fierce, but not nearly as fierce as Omaha Beach, which was further down this way. That was where the worst part of the invasion was and where the most casualties were for the U.S. forces that day. Go on to the next one. This was Tom Meehan. He was the commander of Easy Company. He took over from Sobel. And this was Dick Winters, who was the commander of the 1st Platoon. And I wanted to show you these two slides because this is kind of a story that, well, affected our family, affected me directly, in that my father was the radio man for the headquarters platoon, reporting to Meehan. And he had to be like right wherever Meehan was because he had to have access to the radio. So my dad was a little guy. He was like 5'6", about 120 pounds, you know, tough guy. But when they started doing jumps getting closer to D-Day, Winters realized that, you know, with all the equipment they were carrying, plus another 40, 50-pound radio, my dad was just too small. They wanted a bigger guy to be the radio man. So he says, you know, Wally, we're going to transfer you from headquarters platoon to 1st Platoon. We're going to get a bigger guy to come in and take your place as the radio man. He said, okay, fine. Well, Meehan's stick, or plane, that was flying in for the invasion was shot down before they even got to the drop zone. Everybody on board was killed. And if my father hadn't been transferred by Dick Winters, he would have been killed. And I wouldn't be here to tell you this story today. So it's one of those little things in war. You never know like how different decisions can affect you in the future. But when Meehan went down with the plane, Winters took over as commanding officer for Easy Company at that point in time. They didn't find out about this till the next day, but that was really how the command went, and he took over at that point. The other fellow was Tom Meehan. He was the commanding officer of Easy Company when they went into battle, who was shot down. These were some photos that were taken D-Day +1. And this fella up here, Forrest Guth, I met him at the Band of Brothers premiere years later. I'll go into that in a little bit. But he had taken a camera from one of his buddies and jumped into Normandy with the camera and started taking pictures. You know, once they got into a town where they, you know, at least had a little bit of a break from fighting the Germans. And as you can see, they captured a German flag. This fellow right here, I don't know if you can see it, he's got a German helmet on there that he obviously got from a dead German, I'm assuming. But these are some cool photos that were taken that day. And as far as my father, he jumped into Normandy, and we're not really sure where he landed, and I don't even know if he knew where he landed, but he started fighting, and I don't even know if it was with the combat group, but I talked to a number of veterans. They had no idea. They didn't see him those first couple of days. So he might have been with the 82nd Airborne. He might have been with somebody else. But they were in fighting somewhere near the drop zone in Sainte Marie de Mont. But the day after D-Day, he was crossing a field in one of these, you know, bordered by the hedgerows. This was all throughout Normandy, these little fields that were surrounded by hedgerows that looked like this. And these hedgerows have been growing for centuries. They were mounds of dirt and then trees and shrubs and all kinds of stuff. But in fighting, the paratroopers and the invasion force had to fight through field by field and then get through these hedgerows. The Germans would usually be on the other side of the field shooting at them, and then as they started going through, the Germans would just retreat to the next hedgerow. And that's what it took months, well, not months, it took weeks for the invasion force to finally break out of the hedgerows there in Normandy. But my dad was going through one of these fields the day after D-Day, was that morning, and a German machine gun opened up, and it caught him from his ankle, his left ankle, and all the way up through his right thigh. He went down immediately. This was, I'm going to say, about 9:30, 10 o'clock in the morning. They tried to evacuate him, but every time they tried to move in to get him, the machine gun would open up again. So he was pinned down there for the entire day, loss of blood. Finally, at night, they were able to sneak in there and withdraw him, and that was basically the end of his war. He was shipped back to England and then eventually back to the United States. He was in hospitals for about a year, recovering. The one ankle that had been shot never really fully recovered. About a dozen years later, it was finally amputated. So had one leg. After that, it was 1956. But his war, although he went through tremendous amount of training, his war lasted, like some other guys, 2 days. This gives you an idea what Easy Company went through. Even after my father left, they completed the Normandy campaign. They were there till July 12th. Maxwell Taylor, the commanding officer of the 101st Airborne, told them he wanted to get 3 days of fighting from them, and then they'd be relieved. Well, that 3 days turned into about 36. They were sent back to Aldeborn for rest and recuperation for a couple of months. Then they jumped into Holland as part of Operation Market Garden. The Bridge Too Far, if you're familiar with that, that was part of that invasion. They were going to cross into Germany. They never quite got that far. After that, they were in there till late November of '44. They went back to Mormillon for rest and recovery. That lasted until December 18th. It was supposed to go longer, but all of a sudden, the Germans started moving through the Ardennes, and that was the Battle of the Bulge. So they sent the 101st by truck to Bastogne to try and help hold the city. And they did. They got to Bastogne. They were surrounded, but they were known as the Battling Bloody Bastards of Bastogne, the 101st Airborne. And I don't know if you recall, but General Anthony McAuliffe at that time was the commanding officer because Maxwell Taylor happened to be in England doing a bond drive or something. Things were supposed to be pretty quiet then. All of a sudden, this starts. And the Germans had requested McAuliffe's surrender, and he gave them a one-word answer, which was nuts. And eventually, my father became later on a member of the Nuts Club in Detroit, which was a lot of the 101st Airborne veterans. But they were in Bastogne for almost a month. Went to Haguenau. This was almost like rest and recovery. It was a quiet area, not far from the Rhine River and the Siegfried Line. They were there for about a month. Then real rest and recovery in Mormillon for a little more than a month. And then the final push at the beginning of April to the end of the war, May 8th of '45, they got to the Eagle's Nest in Berchtesgaden, which was Hitler's compound up there in Germany, in the Bavarian, in the Black Forest. So the 101st was pretty busy back then. After the war, my father was very active in the Veterans Association. This was a picture taken at one of the early Easy Company reunions. That's my father right there. That was Ed Tipper, who I showed you before, as my dad's best friend, who he had signed up with. Ed was my godfather. I'd never met him before, but he lived in Colorado, so we didn't see him and didn't really know much about him. These were some of the other veterans. This was Shifty Powers, if you're familiar with the book or the movie. He was a major character, the best rifle shot in the company, and some of the other guys there. This was taken in 1954. This was the Nuts Club of Detroit. Went to a premiere of one of the, I think it was Night Drop. Trying to see which movie that was. But anyway, that's my dad right there. He looks like he's showing how the plane came in probably too low and dropped him, and guys got hurt and all that kind of stuff. But he was very active. He was at one point president of the 101st Airborne Association. And that takes us to Band of Brothers. This was a photo that was taken, this was an actual photo that was taken the day after D-Day. I mentioned Forrest Guth, Goody. That's Goody right there, and this was some of the other members of Easy Company. And this was one that was taken as a promotional shot for Band of Brothers. And you'll notice they kind of look very similar to each other as far as how they had the men positioned and that sort of thing. And I think a lot of the men thought that the presentation in the movie or in the miniseries was very close to, as close as you could get to some of the things that they experienced during the war. But we went to the premiere for the miniseries. This was 2001, June of 2001. They put up all the families of the veterans in Paris for a week, went on a number of excursions, that type of thing. HBO did all this and took great care of everybody. But the day of June 6th of the commemoration, They put everybody on a private train that went from Paris to Normandy. This was in Carrington when the trains landed there. And you can see all the people meeting us. Down here were a lot of the school children that were out there. They still had great respect for the veterans, and especially the 101st Airborne who had fought there in that area. This was a floral garden display, and I don't know if you can tell, but that's a screaming eagle right there, and it looks like the 101st Airborne patch. And this was the day of the ceremonies. This took place close to Utah, just off of Utah Beach, and these were the veterans as they came in to be honored that day. This was June 6th, 2001. And this was what the beach looked like at the time. This was Utah Beach up here. And this was the movie theater that they actually built on the beach at Utah Beach to do the premiere for the miniseries. They built this theater just for this day, and after that they tore it down. It was incredible the expense that they went through on this whole thing. These were some of the photos from the reunion at the miniseries. This is Stephen Ambrose, who wrote the book. This is myself and Ed Tipper. Again, that's the first time I met my godfather. Was there at the miniseries premiere. This was my mother, and on the right was Shifty Powers, a major character in the book, and Bill Garnier, who was a real character in the miniseries, who referred to my father, because my father was kind of short. He says, "Ah, the midget. Yeah, you're the midget's kid? Okay, yeah, you know." If you saw him in the series, the real character was even crazier than the guy in the series. This is kind of an interesting one because this is my son and my daughter with Dick Winters, and this is my son and daughter with Damian Lewis, who portrayed Dick Winters. So it's interesting. You look at Damian, you look at Dick, and they look pretty much alike. And that was something that HBO, I think, really focused on when they did this. This is Joe Burrell, and he wasn't part of Easy Company, but I wanted to include him in here because he was a friend of my father's. He was in I Company, and he was a radio man too, so I think they trained together, you know, being radio men. And he was from Michigan, so my dad knew him after the war through, you know, seeing him at reunions and stuff like that. But Joe's claim to fame, so to speak, was he was the only man to ever fight for both the United States and the Soviet Union. He jumped into Normandy on June 5th, was captured a few days later. He was held in a number of German prisoner of war camps in eastern Germany. He escaped from one in early January 1945 and started going east, figuring he might run into hopefully some Russian forces, which he did. He ran into a Russian tank brigade led by a woman of all things. She was the highest ranking woman officer in the tank brigades. And so he fought with them for about a month, fought with the Russians for about a month. He was very experienced in explosives and really helped them, I guess, in certain battle situations. He was wounded, was sent to Moscow. There he was eventually given his papers to, you know, get back with the U.S. Army. But the thing was, everybody thought he was dead. The Army had reported him dead sometime in 1944. They'd had a memorial service for him in Muskegon, Michigan, where he was from. And lo and behold, he comes back, and so it was kind of a wild story. And this was the cast members of Band of Brothers. This was a lot of drinking going on. This was the last night of the premiere week, and everybody was getting pretty loose that night. So, and this was a later trip that my wife and I made to Bastogne to see some of the World War II sites there, primarily in the 101st. And this one right here was a monument to Easy Company. This was another one to the 101st, and this was the major memorial in Bastogne. If you ever go to Bastogne, there's a lot of cool things to see there. And I would recommend you get a hold of a guy named Reg Jans, Jans. And he was like the best guide. He had been a guide for a number of the veterans, and their families, and so he really knew their stories. And in this next slide, he took us into the Beau Jacques. This was the woods or the forest where Easy Company was stationed, or they were deployed during a large part of the Battle of the Bulge and Bastogne. This was actually one of the foxholes, and he knew where all the foxholes were, and this foxhole was pointed out. That's me in the foxhole. This was Dick Winter's foxhole during the battle. And he was, Reg knew that because he had taken Dick on a tour, and Dick says, that was where my foxhole was, right there. So that concludes my presentation. Right here, this is, I don't know if I mentioned, this was signed by all the veterans, and that if you want to take a look at that, that's fine. I've got a bunch of books that are related to Easy Company, the 101st Airborne, World War II on the table out there, and if anybody has any questions, I'll take them. Yes? What's that?
You mentioned that your dad had passed away before the reunion.
Oh, yes. My dad passed away in 1982. The book was written by Ambrose in 1992, and the miniseries premiere was 2001, so that's when that was done. So he wasn't part of any of that. He had passed away by the time those publications came out.
All right, do you have any questions?
Yes?
Do you know if any of them survived?
No, the last living member of Easy Company passed away, I think it was like 3 or 4 years ago. I think it was Herb Sewerth, who was from Minnesota. And, yep, they're all passing away. I mean, there's not too many World War II veterans left. They're all, if not 100, close to 100 now. Yes?
Inevitably, watching these, now we're looking at the real thing. There'll be someone, he just fought, almost was killed, and all those guys are there, and someone do something funny. There's a sense of humor.
Oh.
The guy dying, just a little.
You had to do that to stay alive. I mean, to keep yourself from going crazy. One thing that came out that some of the veterans told me was that when they first got into battle, they thought, okay, it's not going to be me. I'm not going to be the one getting shot. And that eventually they all came to the conclusion, if they were still around, eventually my number's going to come up. I'm going to get shot and killed, and I'm not coming home from this. And they said that helped motivate them to be good soldiers and actually to keep themselves safer, to have that kind of an attitude. Crazy stuff in war. Yes?
Do you know what Joe Burrell ended up doing after the war? That seems like an experience that would open a lot of doors.
Oh, Joe was, who did he work for? I think he worked for UPS in Chicago for a number of years. And I know he used to go to a lot of the reunions, and my dad would see him at the reunions and stuff. I didn't meet him till that Band of Brothers premiere. And he started telling me about stories about my dad that I didn't know, and I went, oh, geez, Joe, that's amazing. Yes?
A lot of people have seen the Band of Brothers. Unfortunately, a lot of people probably watch it streaming, and they only show the episodes. But I own the 10-disc set, and there's a bonus disc, and that has an outstanding disc. It's the interviews, Ed Tipper and his granddaughter,
That's
Forrest
right.
Guff. So I highly advise anyone, even if you've seen the series, if you haven't seen this, and I forget the name of the thing, but it's about a 1 hour long, and it's actually with the actual veterans talking.
there's Ed is part of that, and I think Don Malarkey, Carwood Lipton, a few other guys, that they interviewed. Shifty Powers was in there too, and probably Bill Garnier. I mean, Bill Garnier was in all this stuff.
All right, do we have any more questions?
Yes?
Hospital in England your dad was taken?
I do not know. I don't think he was in England for a long time after he was transported out of Normandy, and I think he was sent back to the States as soon as possible, but I don't know. I assume it was probably somewhere around Eldeborn, because I think that's where they still had a lot of infrastructure there.
I think from my perspective of going over to the reunion, and so they invited all the widows. So if your husband had passed away, they invited the widows, all expense paid. And as our family, we could go. We had to pay for our flights and our hotel rooms, but we were invited to all of the events. And it was really an opportunity. I love history, and talking to these men. one of the things that they all said was that, and this is true of Keith's father too, is they didn't talk about the war with their families, but they talked about the war with each other. And they also talked to Stephen Ambrose, and I think that's what's so important about, as you mentioned, that the takes that Stephen had with these veterans. For many of them, this was the only chance that they ever had to talk about their war experience. I just saw a streamed broadcast from the John F. Kennedy Library about a new book called The Wounded Generation, about all of the World War II veterans and how they didn't recognize PTSD at the time and how they all held it inside of them. So I highly recommend that book as well, for any of you that may have had World War II veteran family members. But the people that were left were just an incredible group of men. So thank you, Keith.
Well, thank you for having me. And thank Don.